King Solomon's Temple is the main topic of conversation, topic of architecture, and all things regarding Masonry revolve around King Solomon's Temple. Although King Solomon's Temple was actually not the point to the entire situation. The point to the entire situation is the fact that King Solomon's Temple was a copy of the Temple of Tyre. And the Temple of Tyre was a copy of a temple in Egypt, at least one temple in Egypt, and another temple in Egypt, which was built a millennia before then, which leads to a whole interesting sequence of events and concepts that are talked about, illustrated, and part of the basic teachings and tenets of the Kirkwall Scroll in northern Scotland. King Solomon's Temple is absolutely directly linked to the pyramids in a very interesting X pattern. Well, it's actually a infinity loop, but it's, if you don't close the loops, if you don't close the ends, it's just an X pattern, which every York Rite Templar in the world will recognize an X pattern from information I'm not allowed to talk about. Yes, I'm a Mason. Yes, I'm Scottish Rite and York Rite. The X is a key part of stated communication. What the X is made of, you have to become a Knights Templar to do, and to become a Knights Templar, you have to be good standing Mason of the Blue Line, and be a Master Mason, 3rd degree at that. King Solomon's Temple is directly connected to, architecturally, the Pepi Pyramid, which is several miles south from the Pepi I Pyramid, which is north of Memphis and south of Memphis, which is, as stated previously, Memphis is supposedly, by various assorted legends and a variety of architectural similarities, the city of Memphis, which was previous named Lutz. Julius Caesar had that city moved to Rome, and it is currently still there on one of the Julii estates, which there was about 30 or 40 different Julii estates in and outside surrounding the main city of Rome. Main city of Rome was inside the walls, and several estates were outside the walls, but there was also several Julii estates inside the walls. Major, powerful family, and they had owned most of those estates since before Romulus was even born. There's a whole huge Roman Republic, Roman Empire, Imperial Rome, Vatican situation with the Julii family, with the emperors, with the crucifixion, with King Solomon's Temple, the moving of the city of Lutz, the city of Memphis, which it was renamed to, as well as Heliopolis, which Caligula, Julii Caligula, he was a member of the Julii family. Caligula had Heliopolis moved to Rome as well. Caligula had Heliopolis moved to the marsh next to the Valley of the Vatican, which was directly next to the Vatican Hill, which was quarried to make the wall around that area, which was then taken apart and put around the Vatican a couple hundred years later. But that's not the point. That marsh was excavated, that marsh was dug out, and a dry dock was made to have some place for the ship and the city of Heliopolis to come to and rest. What does any of this have to do with the Knights Templar and Masonry and King Solomon's Temple? As you can probably tell, a lot, and it's extremely complicated, to say the absolute least. Architecturally, the Pepi Pyramid, it's causeway. Now, a causeway is a rock walkway. In this case, it's a sidewalk that's like 15 feet wide, with a huge wall on one side and a huge wall on the other without a roof, or the roof was at the time sometimes there and sometimes not over the last 4,500 years. The covering may or may not have been there, but that's not the point. Of course, in the hot Egyptian sun, having a covering would be kind of a no-brainer concept. But that was wood, and that would rot away in an extremely small amount of time. Like 4 or 5 centuries, it's open to the elements, desert winds, floods, rains, what have you, and wood and canvas are gone, unless it's extremely well protected and surrounded by other things where it stays in a ecologically neutral area, like inside of a tomb or inside of a hermetically sealed area. Well, being the roof is not a hermetically sealed area. It's designed to keep the stuff inside the roof pleasant, and stuff outside the roof takes the damage. Well, eventually the damage will destroy the roof, which is the reason why in modern times the roofs have to be replaced every X amount of years, to 15 to 20. The biggest problem is that the causeway bisects something that would not be built until 1000 BC. And the causeway was built at 25, which means the causeway is bisecting something that wouldn't be there for 1500 years. Based on current archaeological and documentation of the area, there was a temple previous to King Solomon's. There's temples after and before. In fact, right now, the pagan temple was destroyed, and another Jewish temple was put in its place, and that was destroyed. Muslimism has an entirely interesting history all by itself, which for 1400 years has been on the darker side of nasty and genocidal and generally murderous. And the Hajj there's a portion of the Hajj that has premeditated murder built in as part of the ritual. The nasty part of that was edited out. King Solomon's temple, the cave underneath King Solomon's temple, the causeway of the Pepi Pyramid bisects it. The cave was there, obviously, because caves are natural occurring. The cave was there. The natural spring that created the cave was there. The small little pool there. They just built the various and assorted dozen or so cultures, 2 dozen, 3 dozen cultures that have owned that specific area of Levant land, Jerusalem. That area has had dozens and dozens of temples dedicated to what or whoever. The problem is that they all ignored the fact that the causeway of the Pepi Pyramid at 26 bisects that cave. So that causeway of the 2600 BC causeway was built to bisect to the millimeter that cave. That cave is extremely important because that cave was built into several aspects of Judaism and Semitism, including ECU, which is exactly where one of the ECU's descendants is Muhammad. Another one of his descendants is Paul, the apostle, Saul Paul, the soul-level enemy of Jesus, which makes the crucifixion even more difficult to understand. Even though Paul didn't show up for 5 years after the crucifixion, that's not the point. King Solomon's temple was a vertical Kaaba, for lack of a better word. It was a 3-story tent that was made into rock. And that 3-story rock building, each floor was about 15 to 20 feet, sometimes more. Each floor was equal, so it was well in excess of 100 feet, 200 feet tall. Ramps and ladders were used occasionally, and of course from the second floor to the third floor you have a staircase, ornately designed and ornately built staircase that led to the floor where the Sanctum Sanctorum would be part of. But the Sanctum Sanctorum would be its own tent on the third floor. That tent would be on the floor, but it would be separated from the ceiling or the walls. It would just be freestanding in the middle of that floor, and somewhere on the third floor. This is King Solomon's design, based off of the Temple of Tyre, which is in all kinds of documentation. But the Temple of Tyre itself was a copy of, most likely, the Temple of Memphis. Memphis itself was named after the pharaoh Menkaure. Pharaoh Mem is the sacred Pharaoh Mem, who existed about 2600 BC, about the same exact time that Abraham existed. The problem is that Abraham, that's not his name. It could not be his name because the word Abraham would not exist until Hebrew, halfway to most of the way through the Exodus, which would not be until 1300 BC. This is 26. That's 1300 years later. So Abraham, according to the Bible, was running around Saudi Arabia and Levant lands trying to avoid the army that was chasing him. He went south, south, met with the pharaoh, south again, ordered the construction of El Bethel, east of El Bethel, the temple, which is approximately where the city of Memphis was. Went south again, came back north, was given a note from the pharaoh to come see me, and this is now. This is as soon as you get this. If you're not on your way, you're in trouble. So he went back north to the pharaoh, and the pharaoh had an argument and expelled him. But his grandson Jacob came back. His grandson Esau was not allowed to come back. He was given command and control over Saudi Arabia, specifically over the city of Mecca, which is, in truth, how a significant portion of Islam started, is from Esau's writing regarding his anger having his brother finally obtain to be the king of kings of the Tabernacle of Adam system in Egypt. He was angry about that. Jacob ruled over his people in the reservation area of Egypt. That reservation area is between Abshur, which is fairly far south. It's some of the farthest south pyramids, and Giza, although that was extended a little bit, about 4 miles north. Right after the pyramids of Giza were constructed, there was the lost temple, the lost pyramid up there was constructed. But we're talking about the Bent Pyramid south and Pepi I north. The causeway of the Bent bisects King Solomon's. The causeway, all the big pyramids have causeways, the big ones. The small ones are support buildings for the big pyramids. The causeway of the Pepi I, on the other hand, bisects the cave of the Nativity. The subterranean chamber under the Kaaba, the subterranean cave chamber under the temple that was the house temple that is the cave under the cave of the Nativity, the cave of the Nativity that's there, and the cave underneath King Solomon's temple. There's several subterranean chambers carved out of the rock in the pyramids, Khufu being the biggest one. It's unfinished, but it's unfinished for a very, very heavy-duty specific reason. It was intended to be unfinished. Because if you look at the architecture itself from no preconceptions, no weirdness, no theology, just look at the pure, hard, physical, tangible, laboratory testable evidence. The subterranean chamber under is very similar to an entered apprentice degree. The next room up would be the Queen's chamber, which is mislabeled. Remember, you have to forget theology. You have to forget fiction. You have to look at the evidence. Is the Fellowcraft degree, because there's a nook for the library to enter the names of the Fellowcraft Masons, the ones that were trained in mathematics and architecture and everything else. Their name has to be entered someplace, and those books had to be put someplace. So the niche there would be where you put books. It also is a place that is designed to make sure that scholars could be there and study, because it has airflow. The ceiling is also covered in various and assorted carbon, which means that there's been a lot of torches in there. Now, the carbon scoring could have been from torches from post-reopening by the Muslims and various and assorted academics previous to the invention of electric light, reinvention of electric light, or it could have been there to begin with, and occasionally it's scraped off. The chamber above that's the King's, which does have a coffer in it. Not a coffin, a coffer. Because it's way too short by like 2 feet to hold the mummy. No, the Egyptians were not 8 feet tall. Their wrappings and crowns and other ceremonial garb do make them 8 feet tall. So it's 2 feet too short. King Tut, who is like 5'1", give or take, somewhere in there, his mummy, before the wrappings were taken off, was 8.5 feet long. His death mask was several inches over his head, and it wasn't really designed to be a perfect fit because it was designed to be a death mask. So it kind of goes over his head and sits on his shoulders, sort of, and his body and head just kind of lay there for all of eternity, or until some archaeologist goes up, digs them up, and puts them in a museum. Those bodies are down in the Valley of the Kings, 200 miles south. Pyramids have zero to do with mummies. You cannot find one single molecule of evidence in any of the pyramids at the point they were constructed or the point that the old kingdom was still in charge of mummies. You can find mummies in pyramids after 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years after construction stopped. The Hyksos invade, they take it over. They're in charge for a couple hundred years. The 18th dynasty is in charge for a couple hundred years. The 19th dynasty takes over by coup d'etat and gets nasty, and it's only after the 19th dynasty, more than 1,000 years, the majority of the Roman Empire could fit in that hole. They hit that history hole. 1,000 years later, a female who's short enough is buried in the Pepi Pyramid. By that time, they lost some of the secrets of mummification, and they did not bury them with as much stuff inside the wrappings, so she was normal size, not 7, 8, 9 feet long. She was only 5-something, so with all the wrappings, she was 5'5" or so. Originally 4'10" to 5'1", 5'2". This matters because time is a major element to all aspects of Egyptian life. Time is a monstrous aspect to everything regarding Egyptology. King Solomon's temple was built at 1000 BC. The Bent Pyramid was built at 26. The Pepi I was built at 21. The caves in Levant lands, of course, are ancient, so they were developed thousands and thousands of years previous, but it still makes an X. South, Bent, 2, north, King Solomon's. The Cave of the Nativity is about 3 miles south of King Solomon's temple. So the Nativity, it's bisected by the Pepi I Pyramid's causeway. So there's another X. North, south X, north, south, north X. They make an X. Now, since they're pyramids, put a line between them, and since they are both connected to Jesus, put a line connecting them, and that makes an infinity loop. Masonry is much more complicated than most people know.